Welcome, my dear brothers and sisters, to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We're on part 32 today. This is the second part of what was started last week, which is a focus on the 13 colonies. As we begin today, we look at a figure that actually is a hero in this story. Last week kind of got a little hot under the collar. If you listen to that one, just about some of the crazy stuff people were doing and nonsense that was going on in the name of Jesus Christ. But the guy today actually did some really good stuff. Now, his story doesn't end great, but I'm a little bit happier today to talk about this one. I think it's going to be less of a bad time that last week was. So hopefully that'll come out as we go through this. So we're going to talk about Roger Williams today to start with. The intolerance in the Puritan colonies had led some to abandon them. The most famous of these was Roger Williams. He arrived in Massachusetts in 1631 and refused to serve as a pastor in Boston. So he got on the bad side of the Puritans there right off the bat. He then declared that the Puritans in the colony had erred in granting the civil authorities power to enforce those commandments that had to do with an individual's relationship with God. He believed civil authorities should only have the power to enforce commandments that had to do with the ordering of society. So anything that had to do with the way society should function, anything that had to do with the way order was kept, those are the things that the civil authorities should have to do with. And this is a breath of fresh air from what we've been dealing with for really since Christianity became controlled by the state, or at least was accepted by the state when Constantine came in, all the way up to this point. Pretty much you had a constant battle and struggle between the state having too much power in the church and or the church having too much power with the state. And it has not led to almost nothing good. Now, you could find a couple of exceptions in there where it did have some good, but in the long run, even those were not worth the damage that was done. And so now we finally have sanity prevailing here. And we've got somebody standing up and saying, this needs to stop. It's not helping either side, and it needs to go away. And we can be thankful for that. He also declared that the land the colonies occupied rightly belonged to the Indians, and that the entire colonial empire was unjust and illegal. So he made the point that the way the land was acquired was not really the right way to go about doing it. And he stood up and said, hey, the whole process it wasn't right. It wasn't done the right way. And even going so far to say it was actually illegal. So he was an early guy to say something like that. There wasn't a whole lot of that sentiment going around, for sure. And even through history, there hasn't been a lot of that sentiment until maybe a little bit more recently. So he was ahead of his time in this idea, and it all had to do with not trying to make things right with a group of people, and for that being the only reason, but because it wasn't godly. It wasn't the right thing for people to do that were said to be Christians and followers of Jesus Christ. And you can look at the times in which they lived, and it was definitely a different time. I have no question about that. But while that's true, it's not okay to mistreat people as followers of Jesus Christ. It's not. You're supposed to be different than the world and the way the world works. And Williams is making the point that's not what has happened. And I think that he's a hero for some of the things that he did and trying to kind of get things in the right direction. He was a great influence again. So you're going to find out his story doesn't end well, but at least there's a whole lot more positivity going through it than what we've seen so far. These and other ideas made Williams unpopular in Boston, and he moved to Plymouth. So, yeah, his ideas weren't popular, especially among people that had the land. What do you want me to do? Get rid of the land? Give it back? Come up with a bunch of money? I mean, what are you saying? None of that's going to be popular. And it's also not going to be popular to say that the church doesn't need to have a hand in enforcing the social law. And so for that reason, he went on out of Boston and moved to Plymouth. He became a pastor in Salem, but when he attempted the secession of his church, the authorities of Massachusetts expelled him. So they invited him to leave as well, and he's moving on out. No more Massachusetts for Roger Williams. He eventually settled with a group of friends in Narragansett on lands that he bought from the Indians. There he founded the colony of Providence on the principle of religious freedom. So Williams has now left. He's going to start his own thing and bring in that same idea of religious freedom that we saw with Pennsylvania and William Penn. but he's going to do things even go further than he did, as we'll see. Williams believed that freedom was required in order to worship God. Worship must be sincere. Forced worship weakens it. And I think we can all agree with this. Anything that's done because you think it's an obligation is not going to be the same. And that's true for Christians today as well. Not that the law says that you have to worship, but when we have the mentality of kind of a checklist Christianity, did I do this today? Check. Did I do that today? Check. Did I go to church Sunday and sing my worship songs? That's not a relationship with God. That's not doing things out of a love for God and out of a passion for Him and as an outpouring of gratitude. That's just doing something so that I can make sure I'm covered. And unfortunately, that is the way some Christians live. And I've found myself doing that as well. I will admit. There have been times where I've lived more of like a checklist, and it's just, let me make sure I've got all my bases covered. And if you look at the time that Jesus came in with some of the problems he had with the religious leaders, you really kind of see the same thing. There are a lot of obligations they put on people, and people were living that checklist mentality. Not that they wanted to, it was being forced on them. But there was a lot of material written to make sure they stayed right inside the lines. And Williams said that's not the way to do it, and he's right on that. In this new colony, rights would not be acknowledged based on religious opinions or practice, and there would be a clear separation between church and state. Williams published his views in a treatise in 1644. So finally, sanity has prevailed. Church and state, separate them. Don't let them one get inside the other. We have how many hundreds of years, how many thousands of years of history to go back and look at and see it does not work? Put a stop to it. And Williams was one of the first ones to do that. And again, even though his story doesn't end well, he's a hero in my book for bringing this in to the 13 colonies and influencing the way that he did. Meanwhile, others had moved to nearby areas for similar reasons. Late in 1637, Prophet Anne Hutchinson was expelled from Massachusetts for claiming to have received personal revelation. So here's another one who gets kicked out of the Puritan-held Massachusetts and has to move on down the road as well. She and 18 others founded Portsmouth on an island near Providence, also promising religious freedom, so keeping up that same idea of religious freedom in the area. Later, a group from Portsmouth founded the community of Newport at the other side of the island. So right in that area, there is going to be these communities popping up, and they're all going to be united by one thing, and that is the idea of religious freedom. All of these communities grew rapidly as Baptists, Quakers, and others came in to escape the Puritan colonies. So they attracted people because they knew they could come there and practice their religious devotion without pressure of the law of the state, without persecution, and then they wouldn't be under civil authority as far as the way that they were practicing their faith. And so that's a big step forward, and people recognized it, and they definitely came and took advantage of it. In 1644, Roger Williams traveled to England and obtained from the Long Parliament the legal recognition of the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations to be governed as a democracy. The reason for this is, remember what he did. He didn't go through the process of doing this kind of thing to get the land that he got. He did it the way he thought was right. He paid the Indians. Well, that might have been the right thing to do, but the government didn't recognize that. And so there started to be some talk among some of his detractors that wanted him out. Hey, we can get this land from him because he doesn't actually have the authority to have it under the English government. So Roger Williams caught wind of this, and he went ahead and took care of it before it became a problem. He was proactive and went in, and he had already done things the right way by compensating the Indians for their land. Now he goes and he does it in the legal way to be recognized so that somebody couldn't come in and try to take this out from under them and in there having a place for religious freedom to thrive. Williams Church in Providence became Baptist. One of the members baptized Williams, who in turn baptized the others, so they turned to the Baptist way. We'll get more into the Baptists as we go through this. But Williams' ideas were becoming increasingly radical. Here's where things don't go so good. His contact with the Indians led him to declare that perhaps their religion was as acceptable in the eyes of God as Christianity, and that they did not have to become Christians in order to be saved. He kind of went native in a way. he really respected these people, and that's admirable because he's living with a bunch of people that didn't, or at least the majority of people in the colonies. And he wanted to treat them right, and he got so involved with the Indian people, and they opened a door to him that they hadn't opened to others because of the way he treated them. He began to kind of start adopting their ways, and finally started saying, maybe I don't need to push them to Christianity. Maybe they're fine just the way they are. I mean, after all, they have a spiritual life. They believe in a God, and they're probably fine. Well, he went too far. And it's unfortunate because he really had done some really great things, but he kind of went to an extreme. And you see these extremes. And it kind of happens in a time where people are being persecuted and pushed. You can get pushed so far the other way that you end up in kind of the bad side of the same coin. And you can be too restrictive, but you can also be too liberal. And in his wanting to get away from the restrictiveness of his time, he went too far and unfortunately ended up not finishing well. But that doesn't take away from what he contributed, for sure. And as we go through this, you're going to see it's going to get worse. Eventually, Williams moved toward a radical spiritualism that led him to the conclusion that all churches were false, and that Scripture was to be understood in purely spiritual terms. So taking away the church, taking away the organization that Jesus Christ himself said that he died for and that he instituted is not the way to go about dealing with the fact that some of these churches had problems. And again, Williams did that. So you can understand him being pushed and being turned off by it, but it doesn't mean that you can go ahead and just throw it out. And that's where he ended up. So didn't finish well, but man, he did a lot. He really did help. And it's so refreshing to hear some of these thoughts that he had about wanting to treat people well, wanting to have the right kind of government and religious institutions so that people could have freedom to worship as they please. And also, remember, opening the door to actually being able to have freedom to worship means that you can do it for the right reason. You're not having to do it because you're being compelled. And that doesn't mean that everybody that lived in a society that they had to, that they didn't feel that themselves, that they didn't want to, but it made it harder. And so now that in this area, it didn't have to be that way. And he's going to be very influential with others as far as this goes. Also, William Penn, of course, too. These teachings were rejected by the Puritans of Massachusetts and by many Baptists in Providence. So the bad teachings he had at the end led some that didn't like him anyway to reject his teachings. And they should have rejected the stuff that we just talked about. But again, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's too much good. You don't want to lose that. So they use an excuse to throw it all out. At least the ones in Massachusetts. The Baptists really didn't, but they did take a stand against some of the bad teachings, and they had to do that. When I was turned to look at those Baptists in Rhode Island, meanwhile, the Baptists of Providence were involved in their own controversies. Baptists were one of many groups which appeared in England during the Puritan Revolution. We kind of briefly mentioned them. When these groups began to be persecuted, some left for the Netherlands. And again, when we talked about that time in history, we talked about that. They did, but not all of them did. There were many that remained in England, and that's going to be a big factor. Some left. They're going to be influenced in the Netherlands. Some stayed behind, and they're going to have a different set of influences on them. While in exile in the Netherlands, a number of Baptists were influenced by Arminianism, which they took with them on their return to England. So all of these English religious movements are going to be very much reformed. But now here's a group that leaves that reformed tradition and goes to be in exile in the Netherlands, and they're going to be influenced by Arminianism, and many of them are going to take Arminianism up. So now you have the big conflict that we still have to our day, Calvinism versus Arminianism, free will versus sovereignty of God. And you're going to see it kind of come into play here, and interestingly enough, with the Baptists, where it actually still is in play. Those Baptists who remained in England continued in strict Calvinism, and you wouldn't expect anything less. They hadn't left and been influenced by any other group. So they're going to continue with what they had always done. Thus, two different groups appeared among the Baptists, the general and the particular. So depending on which side of this question you fall on, you're going to be in one group or the other. General Baptists held that Jesus had died for all humankind, Particular Baptists held to Orthodox Calvinism, believing that Jesus died only for those who were predestined to be saved. So now Arminianism, as far as this question, not all of Arminianism necessarily, but this particular issue about whether Christ died for everyone or just the ones that God had already preordained. And so you've got that now among the Baptists. You've got two different groups, and they're going to have the difference of opinion that's going to be a conflict. In Providence, there were both General and Particular Baptists, so both groups were there. It tended to be, at least early on, that the General Baptists had the most. The Particular Baptists were outnumbered. Regardless, the Baptist movement spread throughout the colonies, even though its followers were persecuted in several of them. Entire congregations were expelled from Massachusetts. And you got to wonder, what was the big issue? We'll get to that. This did not stop them, as they continued to influence some of the most prestigious members of that society, including the president of Harvard. So Baptists had a lot of influence. And we've seen this all throughout our study. Any group that gets persecuted, the group doing the persecuting thinks that they're going to wipe them out of existence. And with very few exceptions, it's actually the opposite that happens. For whatever reason, I don't know if it's in every religious group because I've not studied this. And I don't know if it's with every group, period, because I haven't studied that. But I do know in Christianity, persecution actually brings out more. It brings out more devotion, which is attractive. And that brings people to come in because when they see that a person is willing to give up a lot, their family, their life, their work, whatever it may be, that's something that they say, wait a minute, I need to stop and take notice of this because this is not what people do. And there must be something more to this. And so once again, nobody ever learns the lessons of history. And they do the exact same thing that hasn't worked through the years. The Baptists get persecuted. And as a result of that, they become more influential and they spread even faster than they would have. Slowly, as religious tolerance became more common, Baptist groups surfaced in every colony. So the trend is going to be for more religious freedom as we go through this time, obviously leading into the formation of the United States. At first, most were General Baptists. That was the start. But at the time of the Great Awakening, there was an upsurge of Calvinism because the leaders of the Great Awakening were Calvinists. And in many areas, the Particular Baptists far surpassed the others. So we're going to get to the Great Awakening very soon here in this presentation, but we're going to finish out a couple of things first. And we want to look at some of the other areas and kind of see what's going on with them. We mentioned last week that Maryland kind of got carved out of Virginia in order to give an area for the Catholics. So let's look more into what that ended up looking like. The main center of Catholicism in the North American British colonies was Maryland. In 1632, Charles I granted Cecil Calvert, Lord Baltimore, rights of property and colonization over a portion of the territories that had been claimed by Virginia. So he said, hey, Virginia, we know you got all this area, which was a huge chunk. If you'll go back and listen, it extended way down into Georgia and then up through Maryland. And he said, guess what? I'm taking some of that and I'm giving it over here to Lord Baltimore. Why would he do that? Lord Baltimore was Catholic, and the grant was made to him as part of Charles' policy of seeking Catholic support. So Charles is wanting to try to give the Catholics a reason to support him, and he's wanting to kind of go against the Puritans. And so a way that he goes about doing that is carving out Puritan territory and giving it to a Catholic leadership. It was decided that in Maryland there would be religious freedom. This policy was made to avoid problems with the Protestants in the other colonies. And last week we talked about this. There were a lot of Protestants that had problems with the Puritans that actually left and went to Maryland because the Catholic area was more free. Well, it wasn't just because the Catholics wanted to be free. It was because all of the other colonies were Puritan or at least Protestant. And the problem that they foresaw was if we put one Catholic colony in all of these other colonies and we're hardcore against the Protestants, then what's to stop them from just saying, you know what, we'll just wipe you out. We'll come in and take you over. And so very smartly, very wisely, they decided, okay, we'll be able to practice our Catholicism because the majority of the leadership here is going to stay Catholic, but we'll make it a religious free area so that anybody can come in and practice their religion. That way, there won't be the animosity that could be there with the Protestants. And it worked. It was actually a good plan. It didn't end up working 100%, as we'll see, but it definitely allowed them time to be able to get established. Lord Baltimore followed that policy in instructions he gave to his representatives in Maryland, directing them to avoid giving Protestants any excuse to attack the Catholics in the colony. Once again, we're back to this same idea that if you don't like a religious group, you just attack them militarily or try to kill them. So much of that. And it didn't happen here, but just the threat of the idea that you would even think that. The idea that you would think, well, let's not let the Protestant church come attack the Catholic Church. Let's not give them an excuse. You know, we're moving out of this part of history, thank goodness, but you still see the little lingering effects of it. The first group of settlers arrived in 1634. Approximately 1/10 of the settlers were Catholic aristocrats, and the rest were mostly their Protestant servants. So you have a situation where you have a colony that has been given to a Catholic leader who attracts Catholic aristocrats, but the majority of the population actually ends up being Protestant. So this is going to create an interesting dynamic as this plays out. Tobacco soon became the mainstay of the economy, giving rise to large and prosperous plantations. The colony was governed by the Catholic landowners, but most of its residents were Protestants. Repeatedly, whenever the political situation in Britain allowed, the Protestants sought to take power from the landed Catholic aristocracy. So the people there would bide their time. They would wait until they had a favorable situation in Britain so that they would be supported, and then they would slowly erode at the power. They may not have the power, but they've got the numbers. And they're in a situation where numbers are going to matter, because although there is a strong Catholic influence, it's not mandated. And so little by little, they chip away at this. They finally succeeded when James II was overthrown. Anglicanism then became the official religion of the colony, and the rights of Catholics were restricted. So what started out as being a Catholic population and a Catholic colony is now going to flip. And they kind of sowed the seeds of their own destruction by making it religiously free and bringing in a lot of people to be their servants that were not Catholics but were Protestants. But on the other hand, they kind of did what they had to do. So it worked out the way that it was going to always work out, and that's with Protestants taking the lead because there were just too many of them. Pennsylvania also had a large number of Catholics due to the religious tolerance advocated by William Penn. So that was the other area that ended up having a lot of Catholics because they were allowed to come in and practice their religion without having to worry about somebody stopping them. After the fall of James II, Catholic growth was limited. Throughout the colonial period, Catholics remained a minority in each of the 13 colonies. So it's not going to be till later that the Catholic numbers are going to increase in the New World, or at least this part of it. That's going to come, but not for a while. And then finally, let's look at these mid-Atlantic colonies. The colonies founded between New England and Maryland, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware did not initially serve as a refuge for any particular religious group. So there wasn't a majority religious group that came in and kind of asserted authority. William Penn had a policy of religious freedom in Pennsylvania and Delaware, which was part of Pennsylvania until 1701. So I already heard about William Penn, but you may not have known that Delaware was part of that territory until 1701. And so that same religious freedom policy that he had in place for Pennsylvania was a part of Delaware's tradition as well, because it originally was part of his land. The political and religious history of New Jersey is complex. We're not going to get into a lot of the complexity, but we'll look at some basic things. East New Jersey followed the pattern of the strict New England Puritans, and in West New Jersey, the Quakers and religious tolerance set the tone. So you've got within that colony two very conflicting groups that had to coexist. Eventually, many of the Quakers of New Jersey became a slave-holding aristocracy whose relations with other Quakers were increasingly strained. So the Quakers weren't a group to go owning slaves. That wasn't what they were about. In this group, they got up there and they started seeing dollar signs. And the way that they were able to maximize profit was to enslave people. And so, let's see. On one hand, I've got my religious obligation and what I say I believe, and then on the other hand, I've got a big pile of money. Which one am I going to pick? They picked the big pile of money, and it strained relations with the Quakers. They really weren't part of that group anymore. They became their own thing. They still called themselves Quakers, but they really weren't. What later became New York was colonized by the Dutch, whose East India Company established its local headquarters in Manhattan, and whose Reformed Church came with them. So the Calvinist Church, the Reformed movement, is going to come with the Dutch, who originally had this area, but as you probably know from your history, that's not going to remain the case. In 1635, they conquered a rival colony that the Swedes founded on the Delaware River. Then they were conquered by the British in 1664. What had been New Netherland became New York. So again, as you probably already remember from your history, that we don't call that area New Netherland. It's New York, and that's the reason why. It started by the Dutch, but eventually was taken over by the English. In short, during the 17th and 18th centuries, Great Britain founded and expanded a chain of colonies in North America. Religious motivations played an important role in the founding of several of these colonies. So you see the religious influence of the 13 colonies is big. The founding of them, how they developed, definitely very much involved in the religious history of Christianity and of this area. Although at first some of them were intolerant of religious diversity, with the passage of time, all tended to follow the example of religious freedom in Rhode Island and Pennsylvania. So those ideas that were brought by Roger Williams and William Penn were eventually going to win out. And we have a nation as a result of that is foundationally set on the idea of separation of church and state and religious freedom. At the same time, the practice of slavery, social inequality based on the existence of vast plantations, the exploitation of the Indians, and the expropriation of their land, and many similar factors had dimmed the religious fervor and the hopes for a holy commonwealth that had sparked many of the early settlers. So as we spent a lot of time talking about last week, the chickens come home to roost eventually. If say that you're a follower of Jesus Christ and follow the Prince of Peace, and then you mistreat people and decide that your principles, morality, and religious devotion come secondary to making money, you're going to pay for that. And as wonderful as those who founded our nation are, and as brave and courageous as they had the same faults that generations before them had. They were not perfect people. That's not to say that what they did was correct or that we can just excuse it. It was grossly horrible to do what they did to other people, other human beings. And some of the stuff we talked about last week, which I'm not going to get into because I don't want my blood pressure going up again, they did those things without remorse. And so the religious fervor that they had waned because the almighty dollar took the place of it. And don't we still see that now? It's a condition of being a human being. It's human nature. And that's why Jesus said that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And we see that here. And so unfortunately, with all the good that was done, there was some really bad stuff too. And we're still dealing with the ramifications of that. But let's finish things out on a positive note. We're going to look now at the Great Awakening to finish out this section on the 13 colonies and see that in the midst of some of the evil that was done, although it didn't get done away with, unfortunately, there was some conversion. There was a movement to pull people to come back to God and some repentance that happened. And we see that with the Great Awakening. The 18th century brought to North America the same pietistic currents that it brought to Germany and England. So that pietism comes in. From an early date, many among the North American colonists had felt that a personal religious experience was of great importance to Christian life. They believed that, but was it really the way people lived? But that feeling became more generalized by a series of events that began to happen in 1734, when the first signs of the Great Awakening appeared in Northampton, Massachusetts. And here will be introduced a figure that you probably almost assuredly heard of. The pastor there was Jonathan Edwards, a staunch Calvinist who had been trained at Yale and was convinced of the need for a personal experience of conversion. If that name sounds familiar to you, you probably studied in school about Jonathan Edwards. And if you did, most likely you heard of his most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And so Jonathan Edwards is going to be a focal point in this movement. He had been preaching for many years with average results when his preaching began evoking a response that surprised him. All of a sudden, the same sermons, he didn't change his preaching. All of a sudden now he's getting a different response. So something changed with the people, not his preaching and not the thrust of it. In the year 1734, people began responding to his sermons, some with emotional outbursts, but many with a remarkable change in their lives and with increased attention to devotional practice. And emotionalism can be an issue in Christianity. Some people really thrive on emotion, some do not. And some emotional things don't really amount to much. But you know that it's real when you see lifestyle change. That in anything in Christianity, whether it's an emotional response or an intellectual one or whatever it may be, if there's not coupled with that a change of your life, then it really didn't amount to anything. And the most emotional, you can see people crying, snot, and tears going everywhere, and then they just end up being the same way they've always been. That's just fluff. That's nothing. But when you see a change in life, then you know something's happened. And that's what started to happen here during this Great Awakening. It wasn't just emotionalism. There was actually lifestyle change that accompanied it. In a few months, the movement swept the area and reached into Connecticut. Soon it subsided, and after 3 years, the extraordinary signs had almost disappeared. So it's kind of a movement that peaked and waned, but it's not going to go away completely. It's going to come back. Shortly thereafter, George Whitefield, we've talked about him, visited New England, and his preaching led to many experiences of conversion as well as outward expressions of repentance and joy. So George Whitefield comes in, and all of a sudden some of the same stuff starts popping up again. Edwards invited Whitefield to preach in his church, and it was said that while Whitefield preached, Edwards wept. So we're starting to see now, we got another guy coming in, and God's using him in a mighty way. Presbyterian ministers and others of similar inclinations soon joined in. While some preachers followed Whitefield's example of traveling throughout the countryside, many local pastors brought new zeal to their pulpits. Extraordinary responses were evoked in their churches as well. So you see this all throughout the 13 colonies as God's working in a mighty way through this preaching and within these churches, both from traveling preachers and just the preachers that are in the area that have a single church and preach there every week. Is with Jonathan Edwards, all of a sudden they're seeing a different type of response. People wept in repentance for their sins. Some shouted for joy at having been pardoned, and a few were so overwhelmed that they fainted. So very emotional response, obviously. It's going to turn some people off, and I understand that because I'm not the type that necessarily gets drawn up into the emotional responses. But again, when that's coupled with lifestyle change, then you take notice. And that certainly is what ends up happening here. Such reactions to preaching led the enemies of the Great Awakening to accuse its leaders of undermining the solemnity of worship and of substituting emotion for study and devotion. So there's going to be a crowd that doesn't like it. It's going to be a crowd that says, some of it is just personality. Some of it is they haven't experienced themselves. Some of it is jealousy that they're not seeing those reactions or seeing the same kind of response. But the critics are going to come out. Anytime something like this happens, the critics are going to come out. And sometimes the criticism is warranted. And with anything, there's always going to be openings for criticism. There's always going to be room for improvement. But to go against something God's doing, that puts you on shaky ground. And there were definitely some that came around like that. But many leaders of the movement were not particularly emotive, and many were scholars. So it wasn't just a bunch of emotionalism from the leadership. It wasn't just a bunch of unlearned people that were out trying to manipulate people's feelings. You've seen that kind of thing. That's the kind of stuff that ends up leading to no real lifestyle change usually. You're not going to see that there, where people are being emotionally manipulated and just kind of getting into a frenzy because of the crowd. That doesn't lead to anything constructive. These people weren't like that. That's not what they were about. Also, the goal of the movement was not worship services marked by continual shows of emotion, but rather a single experience that would lead each believer to greater devotion and more conscientious study of Scripture. The leaders, again, they weren't looking to just put on a show and evoke all these responses. They wanted to see the lifestyle change. They were challenging people to that, and they kept their feet to the fire. So again, it's different than some of the other things we've seen come around that we'll get to as we go through this study. Jonathan Edwards' sermons were not emotive harangues, but careful expositions of profound theological matter. So again, not fluff. This is meat. The leaders of the Great Awakening were Orthodox Calvinists. Because of Edwards' Calvinism, Whitefield eventually broke with him. Remember, the Whitefield group, they're not with the Calvinists. So eventually, unfortunately, which is just so ridiculous that this kind of stuff can be so divisive, but they didn't hate each other and they didn't go against each other, but they didn't feel like they could stay together because they thought this issue separated them. And to me, it really shouldn't have. But anyway, they kind of broke off. In the early stages, the movement was led by Congregationalists and Presbyterians, but in the long run, it was Baptists and Methodists who most profited from it. Why was that? At first, the Baptists opposed the movement, calling it frivolous and superficial, but the awakening led many people to conclusions that were favorable to Baptists, and there's one in particular that comes out of this. If an experience of conversion had such central importance in Christian life, that raised doubts regarding infant baptism. This infant baptism thing's still hanging around. The Baptists are not for it. The Anabaptists were not either. And there's starting to be a push this way, and this Great Awakening is going to really get people thinking. This thinking led many Congregationalists and Presbyterians to reject infant baptism and become Baptists. Entire congregations did so. So now we're finally starting to see the infant baptism get flushed out. Finally, I mean, it's taken a long time. It should have been flushed out right off the bat. Those early leaders, Martin Luther and Calvin and Zwingli, they knew that they had to come into relationship with God through faith in Christ, that was an experience that could not have happened as a baby. That was their salvation. They knew not to do it, but it was so ingrained in them that they just didn't go up against it, and it allowed it to continue for a long time. And I mean, there's still churches that do it now. I'm not saying it's gone completely. It obviously hasn't. But there's going to be a push now, especially in these Protestant groups, to let's do away with this. Baptism comes after conversion, not before. And that's the biblical model. And that's what they started to see as a result of the Great Awakening. And that's going to, all of a sudden, the Baptists are not going to have such a problem with it. They're going to like it because people are coming their way. The Great Awakening also led many Baptists and Methodists to the Western frontier. Imbued with the spirit of the Great Awakening, they took up the task of preaching to these Western settlers and organizing their religious life. So a missionary movement to those going out west is going to begin through these groups, and Baptists and Methodists are going to make the move out west to reach those who are expanding out into the Western frontier. For this reason, these two groups became the most numerous in the newly settled areas because they were the ones that were going out after the people. The Great Awakening also had political consequences. This was the first movement that embraced all of the 13 colonies that would eventually become the United States, kind of unified them. Thanks to it, a sense of commonality began developing among the various colonies. At the same time, new ideas were circulating regarding human rights and the nature of government. Those ideas, combined with the growing sense of community among the colonies, would foment momentous events. And we all know what's coming in for the United States. We'll get into more of that as we go through this, but that's all we have time for today. Thanks for joining me today. I do want to just take a very quick moment to give you a little update on where we're at. So in the book that I'm using as the main guideline of how I'm going through all of this history, there's other sources as well, but that's definitely the main one. You see it at the bottom of the page here. It's the Story of Christianity, Volume 2 by Justo L. Gonzalez. That book is divided into 3 sections. With the 13 colonies, we've now come to the end of the second section. So we're going to start next week, the last part of the book. Now, it's not short. There's actually 12 chapters left and then an epilogue, but that's only a couple of pages, so that won't be a factor. So 12 more chapters. I try to do a chapter a week, but obviously, like this week, there was one we had to split. So conceivably, I'll put it like this. We've got at least 12 weeks to go. Possibly and probably most likely at least a couple of those will have to be divided. So you're looking at probably about 12 to 14 more weeks, which will put us into the early part of 2022. So that's what's coming. And then we'll be done. We'll actually be done with this study on the history of Christianity, amazingly. Probably will at least do one bonus episode and have a couple of ideas about what that'll be. But that'll get us all the way through it. So if you've hung around this long, stick with me because we're in the final stretches now. And I hope you have enjoyed it. This last part is going to be very interesting, and it's going to be a lot of U.S. history, a lot of stuff, the events that you're going to be way more familiar with. But just looking at how everything led up to them, I think is so fascinating. So we'll jump into that next week. I'm really looking forward to it. That'll put us at the first series, the first season. We did 40 episodes plus a bonus. We're up to 32 now. So with 12 more, that's 44 and possibly up to 46. So we're going to be 4 to 6 episodes more on this year than we were on the last one. So we're going to go over that, but that's fine. It just is what it is. That's what we've got coming forward, or to look forward to. Hopefully you look forward to it. Thanks once again for taking time with me today. Hope you have a great rest of your week, and God bless.